Learn JavaScript. I repeat, learn JavaScript as fast as you possibly can now, because it is by far one of the most do-it-all languages that we have access to as modern developers in terms of getting things done, because it can and pretty much has done everything in terms of what you would want to do in modern day software, from a server all the way down to machine learning with Tensorflow.js. And I get it. I understand. You're probably thinking there is no way that you're going to be able to teach me everything that I need to know about JavaScript in one video, bro. And you're probably right.
What?
I mean, because JavaScript is a very weird language. What I will say I will try to do in this here video is give you everything that you need to know to be dangerous in today's society in terms of what you need to do with JavaScript in 2024 going forward. Then that will allow you to fill in all of your other gaps that you have along your own journey on whatever you're trying to build or do with JavaScript. And then that makes the entire journey or the entire learning process even more fun. So again, my goal for this video is to give you what you need to know in terms of JavaScript, but I've been talking a little bit too long. Let's go ahead and dive right into the computer and let's get coding. Okay, so now that we're inside of the computer, let's go ahead and talk about what a variable inside of JavaScript is. If you've seen the other video on Python, you'll know that a variable is just a way to store some information inside of the program or the computer. And what that actually does is inside of our computer's memory, we are storing that in so that we can go ahead and use it later. So if we want to store some information inside of JavaScript, the way that we usually do that is by denoting that we want to give this a name. So the way that we do that here is say I'll just say age for now is going to be equal to 25. And then we'll say let name is equal to John. What are we basically doing here? So if I want to go ahead and look at what is going on here, I can just place age in there, and that will then give me the value of age. If I wanted to see what is inside of name, I can do the exact same thing and get John. So that's how we store information inside of our programs and inside of the computer specifically. Okay, so that's all fine and well and great, but obviously you want to do a lot more with just the things that we have, or obviously we want to do more than just printing this inside of the console. But that's the starting point of where we want to go. So understanding that we can do that gives us the option or the access to do what we're about to do now. So let's say we wanted to take John and place, give him a last name. So let's say we wanted to give John a last name of, let's say last name equals Smith, of course. And I now want to display John Smith in a combined way. Now, how exactly would I do that? Well, there's a concept inside of programming called concatenation, which basically allows us to take one string or one word and then place it next to or combine it to another word. The reason why we can do that is because of something known as iteration that's happening underneath the hood, basically, and more specifically, the strings inside or the values inside of our words are known as strings, which also can be knitted together as well. So if you kind of think about it in the way that we maybe thought about cutting out paper as a kid, basically it's the same thing here. So if we want to place all of the things that we have together in terms of strings, we can do that by just saying, hey, I want to say console.log name and then plus last underscore name. Now what that's going to do is give me John Smith, and that's right next to each other, smack dab next to each other. However, what happens if I give, let's say, for example, console.log name plus age? Now, you can see what happens here, but kind of spoiled it a little bit. But you can see that that happens to give us an output of a string, not what we were actually expecting it to do. Why is that? Well, that's because the JavaScript interpreter basically is saying, oh, well, I can put these things together, but necessarily what you're telling me you want on the outside is a string because it's technically what you started with. But it only really can do this because JavaScript is not necessarily a strongly typed language. So what that means is when we give something to JavaScript, it kind of figures it out on the fly on what is going on and then gives it back to us after it figures it out. The compiler does some magic underneath the hood to figure that out, or the interpreter, I should say, does some magic underneath the hood to figure that out. But that's really what happened. But the data types are completely different. Obviously, we can see that 25 is not a string. It's not a word. So why does JavaScript allow us to just go ahead and do that? In Python, if you've seen that in the other video, in Python, that doesn't happen. But in JavaScript, it kind of does. And the reason why is because of that non-strongly typed language thing. It doesn't scream at us, but it necessarily, if we try and do that on the flip side, so if we go ahead and do that over here and say console.log age plus name, we get the exact same thing, just flipped. So the JavaScript interpreter is smart enough to figure out that, hey, we want to put some things together, but it's not completely sold on the fact that we want to break those things apart and also make them two distinct data types as well. So what it's doing is trying to make up, so to speak, a way to bring those things together, but it's not necessarily the way that we would actually want to do it. All right, so the next thing that we need to talk about is JavaScript operators, and they're again very similar to other operators in other programming languages, but here, just to make sure that we have everything covered, we have, or the reason why we have operators in general is so that we can figure out what's going on inside of our programs and then do something with that data accordingly. So we have operators like arithmetic operators such as adding, subtracting, multiplying, and division. We also then have logical operators or comparison operators, as it were, which in this case would be equals, greater than, and less than. And then we also have logical operators, which in this case would be and or. Now, why again would you want to use an operator? Well, again, we want to make sure that we can compare values, we can add or subtract some values if we need to, do some sort of calculation on the data that we have, because at the end of the day, really the main meat and potatoes of programming is moving things in and out of memory, and more specifically moving data from one place to another. So let's quickly do some examples on what an operator necessarily would look. So we can have an operator like, let's say we wanted a result of some sort. So we could say result equals 5 plus 3. So we want to do an addition value. And if we wanted to console.log that to see what it is, we could. There we go. That gives us 8. Could also do a greater than. So greater than is going to be equal to 25 and 5. And then we'll do console.log. That will probably give us a Boolean value though. True. Okay. And then let's look at my notes real quick. Let's do let is valid is equal to username. And if that is not equal to the username, let's find out if the username is equal to an empty string, and password dot length is less than 8. Okay, so cool. And then we'll console.log this guy as well. Console.log is valid. Boom. And that should give us a, oh, right. There's no username and password because we don't have one of those yet. Let's do let username equal blurty and password equal pass 1 2 3. So secure. All right. So cool. So then we get a false. All right. So basically, again, what we're doing here, and if you haven't seen this guy before, what that's saying is we're trying to find out if username is not equal to an empty string and password is not equal to length, or I'm sorry, password.length is greater than 8, then that would be basically saying that this is valid. But we know that that is not true because especially blurty is not equal to a empty string, and pass 1 2 3, that was almost greater than, well, not necessarily, but greater than 8, that is not true either. So both of these situations are not valid. At least one of them aren't. I'm talking a little bit too much. That's basically what we want to know in terms of how do we work inside of JavaScript with these values that we need to do stuff with. How do we gain access to them? How do we find out what's greater than, equal to each other, not equal to each other? This is how we do it inside of JavaScript. Okay, so now that we have a good grasp on operators, now we need to switch gears a little bit and start talking about what conditional statements or control flow actually is in JavaScript. Now, to put this a little bit simply, or to put this very plainly, I made a little explanation on what a JavaScript conditional statement or control flow is in JavaScript. So what it is basically a way to allow your code to make decisions for you and then execute on those decisions based on some type of value or true or false value that has to happen, or conditional value that has to happen inside of your program. Then when we actually figure that out, it enables us to make decisions on the fly dynamically inside of our program. So in terms of control flow, there's a few different things that we can actually gain access to or use inside of JavaScript. The first one is going to be an if statement, or otherwise known as a conditional statement. So for example, if we were going to have a very trivial situation in terms of JavaScript, for an example, we could have if age, I need to probably make age, but I'll do that a little bit later. Let's do greater than equal to 18, and then we'll do console.log of you are eligible, if I can spell, eligible, there we go, to vote. Obviously, this is a great place to put that because this is an election year. Then we will then say else, and we'll keep that on the same line, so don't hurt or make anyone upset while we do that. We'll say console.log, console of you are not, and I'll do not old enough to vote yet. Probably say it to my daughter right now because she's not old enough to vote yet. But this just gives us a really basic way of looking into a if statement. So basically what this does is check if age, and let's say we had a cons or a value of, let's say, let age equal, let's say 25 for now. And you can see that the value on the right side actually does give me you are eligible to vote because the age is currently at or above 25, or I'm sorry, above 18. So if it were 18, so if I could say 18 here, it would also give me the exact same thing. Now, if that drops down below 18 and goes to 17, we are no longer eligible for voting anymore. So all in all, what this allows us to do, or this is the first building block in terms of conditional values that we can chain together really with other things inside of JavaScript to figure out what we're trying to do and make the computer turn things on or off, basically. The next thing that we have access to when it comes to control flow is switch statements, or switch case statements as it were. And the way that that usually breaks down is we have a switch keyword inside of JavaScript, which then allows us to place a value inside of, and we figure out what we want to do with that value based on what factors in or what conditionals we've placed inside of this particular area that we want to then do stuff with. So in this example, what we're basically, or the example that I cooked up here, is going to allow us to figure out the days of the week. So what you're looking at right now is the flushed out version, or the thought out version of the actual example before we use that inside of code, so you can see what we're going to do before we actually do it, the theoretical version of it. But then let's go ahead and look at what this looks like inside of code. So let's say we have day, or a variable called day, and we'll set that equal to 3. What this is going to do for us, let's assume today is Wednesday. Okay. So we're saying, again, we're going to figure out what the days of the week are based on the value that is inside of day. So if it's 3, then we're going to say that that's the 3rd day inside the week, which then means that it's Wednesday. Okay. So from here, let's go ahead and say switch. So here's our switch keyword here. So switch. Then inside of that, what we want to do is place day. So that's going to then evaluate the day and say, what is inside of here? What's the value here? And based on that, we need to now provide the switch statement with some cases to evaluate on. So the first will be case of 0. And if day is equal to 0, then we're going to say console.log today is Monday. Cool. And then we'll just go ahead and break. Now, this break statement, by the way, these are very crucial. Just so you know, that's why I put that there, just so that we can get out of this case statement, because otherwise, how do we stop it? So again, like I said here, they signal the end of each case block. Without them, the code would just basically fall through to execute each subsequent case block. And even if they don't match inside of the value, it's just going to continue to go and go. So we don't want that. So we have to get out of this by saying, hey, break out of this case and then go to the next one after that if this value is not the one that we're looking for. Obviously it is not, so we're going to go to the next case down here, and we'll say case of 1 will be, okay, so then our next case, case 1, would then look for Tuesday. So we'll say console.log today is Tuesday, Tuesday, so on and so forth. We'll do our break from here, so break out of this. And syntactic, and the semicolon here that I just put at the end is a little bit of syntactic sugar that we don't necessarily need in JavaScript, but it's nice to have. Let me move this up a little bit so you guys can see that. Okay. And then from here, we'll say case of 2, and that's going to be a console. Let's bring this down a little bit and give myself a little bit of space. Okay, console.log of today is Wednesday. And then we'll break out of that. I can put the syntactic sugar there if we want to. And we'll do another case. Get out of here. Case of 3. I almost confused myself. Day 0 should have been Sunday. Then 1 should be Monday. And then Tuesday should be 2. Okay, here Tuesday. Now we're on Wednesday. Sorry about that. So we'll say console.log of today is Wednesday. And then from here, I'm just going to fast forward a little bit. So this is pretty much going to be the exact same thing. So I'm just going to fast forward a little bit to the end where we could actually see the full base or the full case of this, so we can actually talk through it. Okay, so now we've kind of gotten to the end of the switch case statement, and this is the way that it fully looks like once it's done. So we can see that we have a bit more cases here. So we have case 4, which is Thursday, case 5, which is Friday, case 6, which is Saturday, and then we have a default case, which at the end, if we don't have a valid value inside of day, so let's say, for example, we were to, instead of 0 to 6, we put 7, then that is going to give me an invalid day. So you guys can't see that, so let me move myself out of the way here. And there you go. There you can see that now. So invalid day is basically what we have at the end if we don't have a valid number inside. If I try to bring this to another number, so let's say 7 in this case. So I have 7 here, but before we had 3. So we had, or we can use 2 if we want to use 2. And you can see that at the bottom here, we still get today is Tuesday. If we go ahead and use, let's say 5, for example, we get today is Friday. But if we go to 7, we get an invalid day because that is the default value at the end if nothing else happens. So let's say, for example, if we don't put these breaks here, and we just allow these to continue to run on through, it will stop if we give the switch case statement a default to exit on. So in this case, the default to exit with is invalid day because we don't have a value of 0 to 6 inside of day, the variable day. So that's a little bit on how switch cases work. In the next example, let's now talk about what try catch blocks look like, and we're going to use a function to do that. All right, so the next thing that we need to talk about in terms of control flow would be the try catch block. Now, if you've never seen one of these before, you might be wondering what the heck is a try catch block, and let me try and dispel that a little bit as much as I possibly can. So what a try catch block is, it's very similar to a switch case statement, but it mostly will be used for catching or handling gracefully errors. And we want to do that inside of JavaScript as much as possible. So we would place that inside of a try catch block. The way that it actually works is inside of the try block or the try area of the JavaScript code. What's going to basically happen is we're going to again find out if the thing that we want to happen or the thing that we are trying to have happen will happen. If not, then we're going to throw that or throw an error inside of the catch or the catch block, and then gracefully error out what's going on inside of our program. So again, just to put this a little bit more succinctly, the try block is going to figure out or suspect what we might potentially want to figure out or do. And if it causes an error, then we're going to catch that error inside of our catch block and then do something to handle it gracefully, hopefully. So for an example, let's look at what that actually looks like inside of code. So to make this a little bit easier for you guys to see and also for me, I'm going to place this at the top of our page so that it becomes easier to see on the output side. Let me 1 second, let me readjust some things here. All right, there we go. When we talk about try catch blocks, what we want to do, or what we would normally do, is place that inside of something known as a function. We haven't talked about that inside of this video, but we will. But what a function is, since we're here, let's go ahead and talk about it now. What a function really is a way to encapsulate some code that we would normally do over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. So Here we'll say we want to divide some numbers. So we'll say divide numbers will be equal to, or well, we'll have num and then num2. That's going to have inside of it a try. And from here, we'll say if num2 is equal to 0, then we'll throw an error or throw a new instance of an error, which would be cannot divide by 0. If I can spell. There we go. So you can see that we do actually get the value that we're looking for, or at least something to that nature that we're trying to get out of this. But it's not fully finished yet, so let's go ahead and keep moving. So let's go ahead and we'll say const result is going to be equal to num1 divided by, sorry, I said num, so num divided by num2. And we'll then say console.log of result, which should be the result variable here. This is still giving me an error because it's wanting me to finish this off, so I will now catch error, and we'll say console.log of error occurred, error.message. Okay. So now let's go ahead and use this guy, and we'll say example calls of divide numbers, numbers, reference to, kudos to anybody who knows that reference. All right, and then we get result is 5 here. So that is what we were looking for in terms of this guy, this try block. If we have a number that is num2 that is equal to 0, obviously we're just going to throw a error here. But if we have something that actually can work, then we're going to do the actual calculation, and that's what happens inside of here, which is where we get this result 5 from, which is what is currently stored inside of result. So what if we then want to divide this by 0? Just test that out and see if it works. So if we say divide numbers by 5 and 0, what we now have is an error. Error occurred, cannot divide by 0. And we get our error message from before, which is what we were looking for here. So how in the world were we able to get access to this message thing if we didn't say that that was inside of error at all? Or more specifically, a better question, where does error actually come from in the first place? That's basically what we've created up here. So when we said the try, or if num2 is equal to 0, what that's basically saying is, hey, check to see if num2 is equal to 0. If it actually happens to be, then we cannot divide anymore. So let's create a new instance or a new object called error. And inside of that object, or inside of that placeholder, there's a value that is called message. That then is what is placed or gets populated by this cannot divide by 0 thing inside of this error keyword. So this capital error here basically means that we're using inside of JavaScript, as it were, a prototype called error. Otherwise, in other languages, it would be called a class, but in JavaScript, it's a prototype. There's also the keyword of class too, but there's a whole nother situation to talk about in that section. Everything that we're doing right now is hinging on the fact that we called we said we wanted to grab a new instance of error, And then inside of error, we wanted to place a message called cannot divide by 0. And when we do that, when we actually have a reason to call on that, what it's going to go ahead and do is create the instance. So we're basically creating the instance here, saying anything that gets passed inside of catch is going to be the error value or the error object. And then inside of that, we're going to have access to message so that we can then display the message inside of this object that we have. Again, that's a little bit further. I'm talking a little bit too fast to that particular subject in terms of prototypes and all that kind of stuff, but it shows itself, so it might as well just get talked about here. But we'll talk about it in more length, in greater detail, in later on in the video when we get there. But just so you know, this is basically what that means. Next up, we need to spend some time talking about objects and arrays. Now, first, I want to explain what an object in JavaScript actually is, and you've seen this in other languages as well if you've seen a Python dictionary or something to that nature, but it's similar to, or even if you've seen JSON in other languages or other places inside of programming, it's very similar to JSON in the way that it looks. But in terms of how it's structured or the way that the code is read by other parts of the code is a little bit different. But basically what an object in JavaScript allows you to do is store values or data inside of key value pairs. And the great thing about them is they allow us to encapsulate or place a lot of things inside of them to create very complex data structures and complex programs if we need to use them or use them as the standalone backbone for a particular program to then stand up on top of that or on the shoulders of that particular object. And by the way, everything inside of JavaScript is technically considered an object. I've been rambling and talking about this a little bit too much. Let's go ahead and do some code to see what this looks like in practice. So we'll create a const called car, and we will give that some attributes here. We'll say make will be Honda, of course. Model will be CRV. There we go. Let's do year of 2022. Why not? 2024. Ball out. Then color will be blue, and we'll say is engine running. We'll make that false. Start engine function, which will then be this dot is engine running is equal to true. So we're setting that true when we actually start the engine, basically. Console.log will be engine started. Cool. And then we'll say we want to be able to stop the engine. So we'll say stop engine, which will also be a function, and that will take this dot is engine running, set that equal to false again, and we'll say console.log of engine stopped. Okay. Then just to go ahead and call this or use it, we'll say call object, and we'll do car dot, let's see, start engine. Yay. Okay. Engine started. Wonderful. We do get what we were looking for at the end of this, but what does it all mean? But okay, so remember how I was talking about before in the previous example in terms of the error prototype or the error object? It's something similar here in terms of how we use objects inside of JavaScript. It's not exactly the same because it's a or that error, that capital E is denoting that that's a class or a prototype. Here we're saying that this is going to be a regular JavaScript object, or as it were, a JavaScript object literal as it is. So what that basically means is we have a bunch of key value pairs, otherwise known as a dictionary in Python. And inside of those pairs, we have a way to get access to data inside of our computer's memory. And if you don't know the basis of how all this breaks down, underneath the hood, what's happening is the program or JavaScript interpreter basically is placing these data points all around inside of our computer's memory, and then we are able to grab that memory or grab the values inside of that memory locations based on this notation here. So it's called dot notation, but what it allows us to do is basically say, hey, go inside of the car object, crack it open, and then see what's inside of it. When you do, what I'm basically want to have access to is the value to actually push the button and start the car. So imagine if you were literally getting inside of your own car, sitting down, and then pushing a button. That's what is basically happening inside of your car in this object as well. Wonderful. Now that we've talked about objects, let's spend some time talking about arrays in JavaScript and what that actually looks like as well. So as it were, and if we can have object literals, we should be able to have array literals as well. But you will never hear anyone say it that way, but it's technically the exact same thing. But what that really is more or less inside of JavaScript, no less, we are creating or having access to the new array constructor. And again, that's going back to prototypes and classes and all that kind of stuff. But the thing to understand here is when we go ahead and use the square brackets in JavaScript, that technically is like a keyword. It's almost as if we're saying new array, and then whatever goes inside of those brackets becomes the value inside of the array. So let's go ahead and actually look at what this looks like in practice. So now that we have a little bit of the theory out of the way, let's look at an example of how we could actually use arrays inside of JavaScript. So the example that I'm going to create here is going to be using grades to find the highest grade first. So we'll say 85, 92, 78, 90, and 100. Okay. Then we'll say, let's do finding the highest grade using a loop. So in order to do this, in order to loop over or find the value that we're looking for, we are going to have to employ a for loop in this case. So we'll do let highest grade be set equal to 0 to start. And then what we'll do is for let I be set equal to 0. I is going to be less than, as long as I is less than the length. So we'll say grades dot length. There we go. Length and I plus plus to increment that. From here, we'll do if grades at index I is greater than highest number. No, I'm sorry, less than highest number. Then what we want, did I say? We want this. Put my parentheses too far ahead of where I was. So if grades at index I is greater than highest grade, then what we want to do is not console log it. We want to highest grade. It's going to be equal to grades at index I. Not 89, I. Yay. All right, so we do get the value that we're looking for here in terms of a 100, so that is true. And then if we weren't actually using the program that I'm using, which at this point is run.js, we wouldn't be able to see the 100 be placed outside of here. So we would have to do a console.log to actually see that. So we'll say highest grade, and we'll do highest grade. Grade. Yay. Okay, there we go. All right. So we can see that our output here is highest grade of 100. But there's some more things that we could do in terms of arrays, and we can kind of see that at the bottom here. Move myself up a little bit. Here we go. Move myself up a little bit here. We can see that there's some other array methods that we can have access to. So there's push, pop, length, which we've already used, reduce, and there's a bunch of other ones in terms of arrays that we can do things with. So map, reduce, we've already talked about. But inside of that, again, this is an object inside of JavaScript, so that these methods now have the ability to be accessed. So length, by the way, is a method that allows us to grab the full length or find out how long the array is in terms of values, and then count those values and do something with that. So in this case, what we're doing with it is finding out if or how long the actual array is, and then saying if currently I is set to 0, if I stays below the length of this array, continue iterating until it doesn't anymore. But there are some things or more things that we could do in terms of arrays, and I'll leave some more documentation down in the description because there's a lot more to talk about there that you can go and read about, and I would highly suggest that you should. But if we want to just say, for the sake of example, go with const total and then set that equal to grades dot reduce, and we don't necessarily have to do a for loop ourselves and write all that ourselves. We can just use the reduce method. For here, we'll find the sum above grade, and then we'll do a sum plus grade. Cool, is that what I wanted? I think, let me check my notes really quick. Sum plus grade, and then one more value at the end of this would be 0. Okay. So let's see what is inside of total really quickly. So if we go ahead and say console.log total, what we get is 445. Okay, so that's all fine and well, but at this point, what does this reduce thing actually do? And more specifically, where does this sum thing come from and all that? Now let's explain where all that comes from and why we can actually use it. So reduce is a method inside of an array, similar to what we were talking about before. So we also have pop and length and all that kind of stuff. But here we are allowed to do some calculations in a iterative way without having to write a for loop. And what we're saying is we want to place the values that we come up with inside of a new variable called sum, or the accumulator as it will be known inside of the actual documentation technically. And then we're going to iterate over the grades. So each grade is going to then get placed inside of the sum after we've combined all of them together. And what reduce actually helps us to do is reduce all of our array values down to one value at the end. So what we're doing here is saying, hey, sum is going to be the value that we want to end up with, but at the end, or when we do start this, we want to grab grade. When we actually get a hold or initialize this though, we're going to start at 0 and then add each of these values, 85, 92, 78, 90, 100. All of those are going to get added up, but we're going to do it in a 2x2 format. So it's going to be 85 plus 92, and then that is going to get spit out as a result, and then that result is going to get added to 78, and then that again is going to get added to 90, and then that again is going to get added to 100, and then again at the end what we have is 445 because of what we've done inside of our reduce function before. So hopefully that sheds some light on how all of this stuff in terms of reduce works. Again, there's more to that, and I would very highly recommend you read the documentation on the MDN website on how all this works. That's where I'm getting this from, but it would be a really good idea to now go ahead and look there. So since we've been talking about this, and I've been dancing around this a few times in terms of this prototype thing, I figured it's probably high time to actually show you what that is and what it looks like inside of JavaScript and why we would actually use it. Okay, so now that we've talked about a lot of the things that we need to talk about in terms of everything leading up to prototypes and classes, now we need to spend some time actually getting into the weeds and the guts of what prototypes and classes are inside of JavaScript. And I have a full-blown explanation on what that is, so you can go ahead and pause right now the video if you want to read all of this. I'm just going to go ahead and talk over it basically because it's a lot to talk about. But what a class or prototype inside of JavaScript is basically a way to encapsulate or enclose some sort of functionality inside of our code so that we can then extend it or use it later, or chain it together for other parts of the code so that we don't have to redo that over and over and over again, because what we want to try and do as best as possible is keep our code dry. And what that means is don't repeat yourself. So I've been talking a lot about what this actually looks like in terms of the theoretical stuff and all that in terms of this video, but now let's look at what that is inside of code. And by the way, prototypes and classes are very similar, but they are slightly different in terms of what they look like and what they can do. Prototypes are considered to be technically a little bit faster because of how they were implemented in the beginning of JavaScript. So they're technically a little bit like a hairline fracture faster inside of your code than the class-based version of prototypes would be. But in JavaScript, they're technically the same thing. They do the exact same thing. It's just that the class-based version of this allows for object-oriented programming in the traditional sense that most programmers are used to. So again, I've been talking a lot. I'm giving you some time to actually go and read what I have on the screen right now. But let's go ahead and figure out what this looks like inside of code and then talk through what all that looks like. Okay, so as I mentioned inside of my notes, I am going to have a base prototype or base object of animal. So let's go ahead and start there. So we'll say const of animal is going to be equal to species of unknown. We'll do num legs of 4. Can breathe. That will be true. Make sound will be a function. So this is going to be a method, by the way. And this method is just going to console.log generic animal sound. All right. So that's pretty much the gist of everything that we need to have inside of this. Let's go ahead and add some more syntactic sugar with that semicolon at the end of there. Then we're going to go ahead and use or construct this prototype, as it were. So let's go ahead and say, let's do dog object from the animal prototype, otherwise known as object. So we'll do a function of dog, and we will have name and breed as the things that we are supposed to have here. Then we'll do this dot name is going to be equal to name, and this, oh, I don't need a colon there, I need a semicolon. This dot breed will be equal to breed. All right. So what's going on here so far, right? So what we're doing, or what we've said so far right now, is we have a object. Again, we've seen what objects look like in terms of object literals. We've seen what that looks like in previous values in earlier parts of the video. But now what we're doing is the same thing pretty much. We're creating an object literal. We're saying that this is what it's supposed to be, or this is what the prototype is going to look like at the beginning and the end of this, unless we actually change the guts of it later on. Then down below, we're going to construct a thing or a object that can hold some of those values. And before we actually do that, we're going to say that we want this dog to have a few characteristics. So in this case, a name and a breed. But now we want to combine those things together. And by the way, this is how we could create an object literal or prototype literal in JavaScript. This is a way to create it as a constructor, similar thing in general. But now what we want to do is combine the animal with the dog. So what we're going to do here is say dog dot prototype, and we'll set that equal to animal. And I forgot, I misspoke earlier. I switched that around. The function dog is technically the prototype, and the animal is the we're inheriting base values from an animal. So whatever an animal necessarily would look like, this is what we're doing. But more or less, this is the constructor of that. So this is the this function dog is the constructor of all of the things that we can have access to inside of the overarching prototype once we combine animal and dog together. So now that we have, what we can do now is see over to the right hand side. Let me make sure that you guys can see that. You can, but I'm a little bit up top of it. So let me move myself around here. So you can see that. I'll just move myself off screen. You can see that a little bit to the right there. And basically what that is basically saying is we have species, which is unknown, num legs, which is 4, can breathe, which is true, and then make sound is a function, or that is a method, as it were. However, we don't have name or breed listed inside of this list at all, because what we have to now do, because we said we wanted to construct a prototype and then bring all these things inside of it, or extend the literal prototype that we created before. Now that we have a constructor, we want to use or place the values that are inside the base prototype inside the constructor, which then makes it a complete object after that. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and see what that looks like here. I'll bring myself back on screen, and let's see what we got here. So what we need to do from here is go ahead and use the dog prototype that we created. So in order to do that, we would then create a constant in this case. So we'll say const of buddy. It's going to be equal to new dog. And he is going to have a buddy of the name, or name of buddy, and then golden retriever will be his breed. Okay. So then if we want to look at what is inside of this guy, and let me bring myself off screen again so you guys can see that. I'll bring myself off screen, and then what we'll do here, console.log buddy.name. And what we should see is buddy. So that's what we get right there. Cool. So all in all, this is how we would use prototypes, or this is an example of prototypes inside of JavaScript, or how we would create a prototype and then go ahead and use it inside of JavaScript, and more specifically, how we would grab two different things and combine them so that we can use a overarching prototype that has more values inside of it that we need to use from there. So now that we have a grasp on prototypes in general, let's look at what classes look like. And again, they are very similar in terms of how they look and what they do. Okay, so now let's look at what classes inside of JavaScript would look like. So a class inside of JavaScript, again, is very similar to a prototype in the way that it works, but the syntax is going to be different. So what we're going to do is say class based example, and we'll use the class keyword and call it person. Here we'll then say we need a constructor, and that's the difference between a prototype or an object prototype and a class, is the class and the constructor happen in the same basic step. So we'll say constructor of name, and then we'll say this dot name is going to be equal to name. Remember that from before. We did that similarly to in a different example with our dog with name and breed. Then here we'll say, oops, there we go. Then we will need to add a method here. So we'll say hello. And from here, we will console.log hello, my name is, and then I'll just concatenate this here of this dot name. Okay. All right. Okay. So now that we have that, now let's look at what classical inheritance inside of JavaScript would look like. And it's very similar to before, but this would be, let's say, classical inheritance. And we'll say class of student is going to extend or extends person. Oops. And then we'll say constructor name and grade. We're going to use the super, which is going to grab the values from the person, by the way, and we'll say name there. So we're going to allow this dot name that happened here to govern what happens with our value here as well. Then we'll say this dot grade, because we did not specify that inside of person, so we have to now say that we need that. And we'll say grade here. Then from there, we will say we want to introduce ourselves. So we'll say introduce self. And console.log of hi. We'll do the name here. So we'll say $ this dot name. And I'm in grade, and we'll do this dot grade as well. Okay, I think that's it. All right, so let's go ahead and create some instances of these classes. So I'll create some instances of the person class first. So instances of the person class. Make sure that I'm not out. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Instances of the person class. And we'll say John dot say hello. Jane dot say hello. And then we'll do James at the end of this. And we'll say, oops, I did not create them yet. Let's create them first. So we'll say James dot introduce self, but we have to create the instances of these first. So let's create those. And we'll say let John equal new person, and we'll call him John. All right. Then we'll say let Jane equal new person, and we'll call her Jane. Wonderful. And then let James equal to new student this time. And this time I'm going to add some trickery here. So notice as we move myself out of the way, because I am in the way, I believe. Yeah, there we go. Notice that what we have right here is hi, I'm undefined, and I'm undefined, and I'm in grade undefined. So currently what that is basically saying to me is it's looking for this name guy right here. This name basically is coming from this guy up here. And it's also saying that it wants to grab hold of grade as well, but right now it's also undefined because it is. And because of that particular fact, it is spitting out undefined in both of those areas. And in both of those areas, we said we wanted this dot name and this dot grade. Also, something to note here, this keyword, we've talked about this earlier in the video, but it bears repeating specifically here now. This refers back to the class in this case. So it would be as if you're coming from a Python-based situation, it would be as if we were saying self whatever or self dot whatever or self dot name in this case. This dot name is the same thing. So if you have any background in Python and you're coming over to learn JavaScript in this case, and you're starting here, welcome. But this is basically the exact same thing that's happening inside of those classes with self. So understanding that now helps us to understand what's happening under the hood inside of this guy right here. And now if I go ahead and gain or add some values here of James, we'll get James in that undefined area, in the first undefined area. And then if I add a comma and then say, let's just go with first for now, that then will add the first value here. And we can also obviously change this, so we could go 12th as well, and what have you, or I'm in university, or whatever, right? Whatever. We can do whatever we want here, place whatever we want inside of that. But the reason why is because and I've been off screen the whole time trying to talk to you guys. So the reason why that we can do that is because, and actually let me bring myself center so it's not, there we go. The reason why we can do that is because, I'll just go back off screen. The reason why that we can do that is because of this guy over here. So we said we wanted to create a new student. And then when we created that student, what we did inside of that, or what the code then went ahead and went back up and did, is say, hey, is there a student class? There is. So let's look inside of it. What's inside the constructor? Well, the constructor now has two values that we should be looking for every time that we create a new student. So that's going to be the name and their grade. What is their name and where are they currently located in their matriculation through education? All that to say is basically what we're placing inside of this constructor, and this super now allows us to go inside of the person, grab this dot name, and then allow us to use it down here without having to say this dot name again. It's basically as if we already did it. So now we basically all we have to do from here is just go ahead and use it and add anything else that we need to use inside of this newly constructed class that we need to have inside of our program. From there, we can really do whatever we want, add any methods, add any attributes or what have you. But now we have a way to encapsulate the values inside of our code and make it more reusable for later on. Okay, so now that we've touched on basically the guts of JavaScript in terms of how the overall syntax and the actual language looks and feels and works and all that kind of stuff, the inner workings and prototypes and all that kind of stuff. At this point, now we need to spend some time talking about what the event loop in JavaScript actually is and what it's for, what it does, and why you should understand it as a developer, even in the generation of AI. Specifically because what it does and what I've done here is, instead of making something in front of you, I've gone ahead and just created this because it's very trivial in terms of the actual example, but I've placed this inside of a function so that it doesn't actually run until we need it to do what we want it to do inside of this example. But what the JavaScript event loop actually is basically, think of it as if it were a stack, because that's basically the way that it's designed. It's designed as a call stack, as it were, or that's the name of it. Basically what that allows us to do is place one event on top of the other, and after one event happens, then we take the other one off, and then we keep on placing more on top of that until there's no more. So again, imagine you're stacking a bunch of plates on top of each other, and then you're just popping those off of each other as you need them. As the next one comes up, you take it off. The next one comes up, you take it off. The next one comes up, you take it off. And it just keeps going in this cyclical situation over and over and over and over again. That's what happens inside of our web browsers, or more specifically inside of our web apps. There's always some event that the user is triggering, and we are always listening for those events. And when those events happen, we need to do something because of it. So that's the call stack, or the event loop, going in a circle over and over and over again, listening for these events from our user. So to simulate that inside of this example, what I've done is placed a function called event loop sim, obviously. And what we're going to do is say console.log script started. And we're going to start our script. Basically, everything is going to kick off here. But what's going to happen then is we're going to see this script end happen here, but we're going to not see this delayed message after 2 seconds, for at least 2 seconds. And that is basically trying to simulate the calling of the event, or basically something not being there and then something appearing, and then we take that thing off if we were going to go and do something with it. So if I go ahead and call this event loop sim function, that is going to start. So script started, and then you'll see delayed message after 2 seconds happens here, which basically is exactly what we were looking for, that delayed gratification, as it were, of the event loop giving the value that we need in terms of us working with it so that we can go and calculate some data or log the user in or what have you, whatever event has to happen on that particular situation. All we're doing is listening for that. When we see one, we're taking it off, or if we're listening for a specific one, like let's say we're listening for a mouse event, when that particular event happens, then we take action. So understanding the event loop is very critical in terms of understanding the life cycle of your JavaScript programs, because they do go top to bottom in terms of the file, but inside of it, the guts is more so basically saying, hey, I'm listening for something to happen over and over and over again. And if nothing happens, then I'm just going to stop. And that's basically what happens inside of your event loop. If nothing happens or nothing else needs to happen, it just stops. There's nothing else that needs to happen. Dead. Done. We're done. Go to the next thing. But usually on a JavaScript situation, there's always something else that is going to be listened for. So that's why the event loop seems to be a constant thing. All right, so we're rounding third and heading home at this point in terms of things that we need to know to be dangerous inside of JavaScript. There's a bunch of other things because JavaScript is a very weird language, but in terms of what you need to know to get off the ground and actually get walking, the last bit of that would be promises, and then after that would be async await or async await functions. But for this particular set of what we want to talk about right now, let's switch gears and talk about promises and what they are and what they actually do for us. So I've set up a little bit of a scenario here. Imagine that we want to fetch data from a remote server. You don't know how long that is going to take though, so you need to wait on that thing to actually come back to you. Well, would you want to wait a bunch of seconds? Or if you take, for example, if you're the user, would you want your user to wait? Or more specifically, would you as your user wait 5, 10, 15 seconds? No, I didn't think so, because that is probably the stretching of all of our attention spans at this point because of the modern generation that we live in. But it's even worse when you come to a web app expecting it to work exactly the minute that you land on it and it doesn't. Even at a second, your users are probably going to leave. So to not have that happen, or to mitigate that as much as we possibly can, we now have the ability to use a promise. And a promise represents an asynchronous operation that basically allows us to promise an object will be created for us to represent this data fetching action that we're trying to do. If that does happen successfully, then we get the data back. When it's actually happening, though, it starts as a pending state. And when we get it, or if we don't, then we get a resolved or rejected value after that. So we are basically looking for an event in this case, or state that we're looking for our data to be in. And once that state changes, then we're going to act upon that as well. So you'll see that later on in different frameworks. If you're just starting this, by the way, if you're just starting out your journey on the development situation, you will see state everywhere inside of JavaScript framework. So just get ready for that. But really what that means is just data. So yeah, that's pretty much what it means. So what we want to do from here is we want then to check if we have a resolved value, or, and then again, the resolved value is the operation succeeded, or we have a rejected value, and that means that it failed. Again, saying that something happens or something did happen, but we want to know what. So what does that actually look like in code? Well, I'm glad you asked, because exactly what we're going to do next is look at an example of what that promise or a promise-based function would look like in code in JavaScript. Obviously, that's the whole point of this entire video, right? So I'm going to start up here because otherwise you wouldn't be able to see this. So I'm going to say function fetch data. That will then be returning a new promise. Remember from earlier that capital P and then the new instance thing means that we're creating a instance or a new object of a promise, or new instance of a promise object, which, if I'm not mistaken, also is a prototype as well. I got to look that documentation up, but I believe that is a prototype as well. It could be class, but I don't think it is. But off the top of my head, I believe that is a prototype. Anyway, what we want to do from here is basically give some parameters, and basically this is the constructor or the creation of the promise in this case. So what it expects is two values to be placed inside of the object at all times. And those two objects are going to be conjoined together. So they will be they will be resolved and reject. Okay, cool. Now, I'm going to do some more syntactic sugar stuff and use what is now known as an arrow function because of the advent of ES6, which is a more modern version of JavaScript. So I'm going to say arrow, and that's just equal sign greater than sign, by the way. And from here, we'll say what we want to do inside of this is simulate a network request that takes 2 seconds. So back to that 2-second rule from earlier. So we'll say set timeout. Is that, yeah, lowercase timeout. And that should have that's a callback, so it needs that. Okay, cool. Make sure I'm not fat fingering something here. I am not. Okay. Yay. Then we say const data is going to be equal to message of data from server. So we're just getting some random data here, nothing really fancy that we really need to do mission critical stuff with. Resolve that data if that is the case, and if not, well, you know what we got to do next? We got to actually take it out. So let's see. Yeah, we need to do, or if something goes wrong, we will reject. Reject. And we will also need to close out our set timeout, by the way. So give me 1 second to do that. That will be here. So 200, because we want that to be, 2,000, sorry, 2,000 milliseconds. We want that to be 2 seconds. So that, I think that's right. It looks right. Cool. All right. So now that we have this, what can we do, or what are we going to do with this? Well, we're going to actually go and use our promise in the way that we would need to, and in the more traditional way in terms of using a promise, the way that you would do that would be a .then and then .catch. So it's a little bit closer, or a cousin to the try catch block, but it's a little bit different because it's inside of a function and it's a method on top of a promise. So it kind of takes the idea from a try catch block, but it looks a little bit different. So in here, what we'll want to do, and we'll say using, make sure you guys can still see that. Yeah, you can. I think so. Using a promise, if I could spell it, promise. Fetch data dot then, pass in data console.log success conquer. Sorry, I always want to say that. And dot catch. So that again is going to take a value or some type of object, which in this case is going to be error. Remember from before when we did the error handling, that did come to us as a error object. So we can do that here as well. And we'll say console.log error, danger, Will Robinson, danger. And we'll say error. All right, cool. What did I do? Fat finger somewhere. Missing semicolon. What? Where? Somebody line me. Okay, so you might be wondering what in the heck just happened right here, bro. Well, let me explain that a little bit further for you. So what happens here is fetch data is going to return a promise for us. And when that promise gets returned, that gives us back an object or a promise-based object. And inside of a promise-based object, we have something known as a method, or in this case, two methods specifically known as resolve or reject, and in this case become dot then and dot catch. So when we do ask for those values, what we can place inside of them is the data that we were looking for, or if we don't get the data, we're going to pass back an error. It's basically technically the same object that gets passed back to us, but we're just calling it something different in this case. And the reason why is so that we can syntactically and canonically understand what is going on, because otherwise 5 months outside of writing this program, you come back to it, you probably won't understand what's going on. So it's trying to make sense of that, but more specifically, we're getting access to something that we didn't have access to before, let's say an API, and then when we get the data that we're looking for, we don't just stop the program. We continue on and do the other things that we need to do in the background, let that cook, and then once that is done, then we serve that up to whatever we need to in terms of the platform that we're working on or what have you. So a promise-based situation is probably, in terms of modern situations, what you're going to see littered all over JavaScript, and something that you need to become really, really, really familiar with. Oh, and you might not have been able to see the actual running of that data, so sorry. I'm just going to bring my face. Over here. Okay, so now that we have a grasp on what promises are, let's see how we can actually work with them a little bit easier in terms of this whole mess that we have here, which, by the way, if you don't know what that actually is, or the term for that actually is, the dot then and dot catch would technically be known as callbacks in terms of older versions, or slightly modern but slightly older versions of JavaScript, and you would see yourself in something known as callback hell. And we don't want to have that inside of our programs, because it becomes really, 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 really hard to debug and actually maintain. So the way that the folks that be came up with a way to solve that is by introducing promise-based async await, or more specifically, async await functions. So, what we can do with that, and the way that we would actually get that done, is by creating or using the same fetch data promise-based function that we had from before, but now we're going to change this guy just a little bit, and it's going to technically do exactly the same thing. We're just going to use it slightly different. Okay, so here's how that's going to work. I'm going to, again, I'm just going to take that out so it's a little bit easier for you guys to see that and make sure that it actually is. Okay. And let's go ahead and use the async keyword. And that's how we denote this, by the way. So we'll say async function, and we'll call it display data. And yeah, we will then say try. Excuse me. Const data is going to be equal to await fetch data. And we'll say console.log success. Data. And then we'll have our catch at the end of that. So we'll say catch. We needed to catch an error, so we need to pass that in here. So error. And we'll say console.log error. And I believe that will be error here. If I could spell, there we go. All right. So now if we go ahead and call this and make sure that my big old head is not in the way here. We go ahead and call this guy display data. What we'll again see will be the pending value. So that's how everything starts with a promise, similar to what we saw before. And then now we have a success message. So data from the server, yay, we were able to get something from the server. Woohoo. Now, if that were obviously not available, some type of error message would come back to us and we would handle that accordingly. But because of the way this is set up right now, everything is just going to be 200 success because it's just, data is always going to be there. But if, for example, there were a situation where the data was not there, then what we would then see would be this guy right here would be basically say, hey, the promise came back, but when it didn't resolve, it got rejected. So it basically, we could set up a certain amount of time to wait inside of our resolver. And if we don't get a value soon or in a soon-ish fashion, then we go ahead and just drop down to our reject and say, nope, we're done. We don't have anything in there. Cool, error. How do we resolve this from here? Either we just say there's nothing there. You need to add something. So maybe the client or the customer needs to fill out a form or something like that. Like there's a bunch of different ways that we can handle that, but this is a way that we can say, hey, there's something missing or we have everything we need. Let's keep going. But we can figure that out on the fly without having to stop execution for everything else around our program. And that's the reason why we would want to use promise-based functions in general where we can. Okay, so we've basically gone through pretty much everything that you need to know for being dangerous in terms of JavaScript and what would be useful to know right now. But there are a plethora of things that will come up as you work with this language because there are a bunch of different pitfalls and gotchas and all kinds of things. And I practically just scratched the surface on how and what you can do with JavaScript in terms of what is inside of the language, because there's so many things like date manipulation and all that kind of stuff. In terms of resources, I wanted to leave you with these two specifically, and that would be the MDN web docs, which would be the quintessential place to start with JavaScript in terms of where you want to understand the documentation. You can also go to W3 Schools as well, but I usually like to go directly to MDN because that is the place where JavaScript is maintained, or the overall language ECMAScript is maintained. So I like to start there and then kind of filter what is going on from there with other resources. But I would also pair this with Eloquent JavaScript. And by the way, you don't even have to buy, or at least I don't think you have to buy all. Yeah, looks like this is completely free now. Wow, I didn't even know that until I opened this. But You can literally go to eloquentjavascript.net and go and read this entire book for free and understand what JavaScript is, how it works, the good, bad, and ugly parts of it, and what you can really do with this language. I would highly recommend you pick this book up in physical form, though, so that you can actually reference it when you need to. If you are that type of person that you need to have something handheld, which I am, so I do have the book on hand, literally in my office as I'm working on JavaScript problems. Literally, it's right in front of me right now. I would highly recommend anyone that is starting with JavaScript, and if you've been working with JavaScript for any length of time and you haven't read this book, please do yourself a favor and get it, because it will save you a lot of time when debugging and coming up with new solutions on solving different things, business problems, and what have you, in terms of using JavaScript. And well, now that you know about JavaScript, maybe you want to learn more about Python. And if that is the case, you might want to start right up here. If not, let's go ahead and try this video, because that will tell you about something else in terms of programming or investing or AI or something of that nature that you probably want to know. And if none of those things are what you want right now, kind of awkward, isn't it? Sorry.